I should check, Paul, because Ian raised that issue about you being a firefighter. Is your preferred term firefighter or like old-fashioned fireman?
No, firefighter. I'm very happy
Yeah.
with firefighter. That's what everybody in the service uses.
So, what is your history with that? Are you still involved? Because you do a lot of media now. I assume you sort of.
Well, firefighting is still my day job. It's still
Right.
the primary job for me. So everything else I do, writing-wise, media-wise, has to fit around that. So I've been a firefighter since 1997. So 24 years getting on for.
And was your father one before you?
No, I mean lots of firefighters did come from that tradition, but I didn't. It was just something that appealed to me. And
was it because your name suggests a dying fire? That must have been pointed out to you before, but
believe it or not, well, it has, but not as often as you might think. The funniest of a firefighter.
It was appeal to Ian. Doesn't involve Stalin. He's not happy.
There was an interview. There was a big fire in America, and I saw an interview on TV, CNN or something, and the firefighter was called Firefighter McBurney, which was
not Bernie, but Burnface.
But might well have been Bernie McBurney. Yeah. So it's my mind doesn't quite reach that standard, but there is a subtle link, isn't there? Which
I mean, it is almost comical. You are red-haired. You are called. You have a fire bait. You are a kind of iconic figure for the fire service.
I'm the archetypal fire service.
Yeah, you would make an excellent ambassador. But Ian, I don't think I've ever asked you this, but you used to write a column for the Architectural Journal, yeah. Were you an architect before? I don't think I've ever actually asked you. No. So have you ever had a proper job, or are you like Springsteen? Are you basically a sort of chronicler of blue collar interests from a?
Well, that's hedging me very firmly to a very detailed little corral there. But to be honest, no. In the 20th century, which is where I'm from, and where I belong. In the 20th century, I was a musician and a journalist. So I did work for the Architects Journal, but I was apprenticed actually. 73, I was apprenticed, and in those days you could get an apprenticeship in journalism. You would sign up for 3 years indentureship to a local newspaper group, of which there were several, massive, all making tons of money off small ads. Imagine that.
Yeah. Something we'd like to bring back. I think it might be, and it will hopefully come back up later, a rejuvenation of local press and local media. I think it's long overdue. I don't know exactly how it works.
Was it the Architect Journal? It sounds like one of those magazines that's brought up at the end of I Got News for You, where they have the blank words coming from some obscure. Did it ever feature on that?
I don't think architecture, Paul. I don't think architecture is as mockable as, say, biological chemist quarterly or something. People are good point.
To be fair, though, your column did mock it quite ruthlessly and brilliantly. I mean, that's
everything.
When I first encountered you.
Yeah, basically, and then so that's why in the 20th century I was a musician and journalist. Now, the 21st century, basically, I've taken a piss, and that's my career.
For anyone who doesn't know, and I don't know whether Paul is aware of this, but the first job title I saw recorded to you was swearing advisor on the thick of it, and I know that's become a bit of a. It's swearing consultant. Yeah, that's right. For Malcolm, I assume that was mainly, was it?
No, it was
for everyone.
It was for the script in general.
Right.
But Armando Iannucci, who called me that. Oh, we were drinking wine.
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned it. I've got a nice Rioja on the go here. Yeah.
I've got a cheap bottle of Merlot from Aldi. I thought there's no way I could be portrayed as a Waitrose shop in North London.
Aldi's very good value for red wine and Lidl as well. Two of the best sellers you'll find on the high street. Go and run, Ian. Yeah, absolutely. We'll hold the ball up while you're going, because I've watched you on podcasts. Oh, that didn't take long.
No, it didn't.
He's got a crate behind him.
Yeah. I'm a sneery metropolitan elite. I've got an entire wine cellar. Just press a button and it comes up just behind my
button for champagne.
Simon, talking about past history, this is a complete coincidence. I was watching recently an episode of Only Fools and Horses, a Christmas special.
Yeah.
And I went on Wikipedia or whatever to look down the cast list, and you were on it.
Yeah, that's a mistake. I don't know
Is
whether
it?
it's another Simon Evans or whether that's just a complete mistake, because I did used to do a long routine about living in Peckham. And my opening line was, for those of you who've only ever seen Peckham on Only Fools and Horses, TV has a way of glamorizing neighborhoods and you shouldn't be misled. And I don't know whether I got associated through that, but there was another Simon Evans fraud. There's another hugely famous Simon Evans now who's completely vaulted over my meager celebrity, who wrote Staged, the sort of Zoom-based sitcom, yeah, with David Tennant and Michael Sheen. So he's now the Simon Evans, and my rankings are falling away, and this is how it happens.
Just on your Peckham gag, I don't know if you ever heard Linda Smith's the late Linda Smith one. She said that I grew up in Dagenham, she grew up in Erith, and she said once that I grew up in Erith, it was a bit grim. It wasn't twinned with anywhere, but it did have a suicide pact with Dagenham.
Yeah, that's a cracking line. You used to have to open every stand-up set with something like that. I know what you're thinking. So and so has let himself go, or I am the love child of such and such, and then a gag about where you come from and why it's a shithole, or possibly why everyone there eats hummus. Which was then regarded as the sort of shibboleth of middle class aspiration.
Wasn't that supposed to be like a tight 5 minutes of local or something? What was it telling me? Chris Addison was telling me you always open with oh well, here I am in Dagenham, and just forward what the fuck happened there? I don't know. I can't think of any jokes about Dagenham.
You've got to have a proposition. You've got to have a key proposition that the audience can grasp very quickly. Who are you? What's your angle? What's your perspective? I mean, we could use this as a segue into what I wanted to talk about, which I suppose is, if the Labour Party had one of those now, what would it be? Because that's what part of their problem. And it was seeing your article, Ian, about that, really lovely, but quite sort of, I suppose it was sort of more poetical, sentimental, or personal, about the pits and how you felt about the sort of the long drawn out death of the pits. And it wasn't supposed to be a sort of new policy document or anything, but a sort of sense that Labour has no longer quite got anything that it's associated with as that it's like a heart and soul kind of attachment.
It's the 20th century again, isn't it? 20th century is the century of mass activist politics. People, you have thousands of people out on strike. Now, when I was doing my first beat, actually, as a local reporter, covered Easington Colliery, which is one of the last few left in County Durham, the County Durham minefield. Manny Shimwell was still MP, and they just waived the votes. There was no. I'm not sure there probably was a token.
Yeah.
Lib Dem, I guess. Tory wouldn't have stood. Tory would have been massacred.
Yeah.
And the pit closed. Everything imploded. Like everywhere else, Labour lost its way. In fact, I was reading something I wrote about 7 or 8 years ago. I went to the Labour Party conference in the Miliband time, and you could see it on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, the immigration pledge on a mug. On the other hand, and it was kind of, PFI, it's the only show in town, so let's go with it. All that shit. You're right, and Paul's right. Who are you? What are you for? And where are you going? And what story are you telling about where we all want to go together?
And maybe even, where are you from? Which is it's a slightly old-fashioned and sentimental thing, but I know, David Goodhart's written that book. Paul, I'm interested, and I've seen you mention Goodhart's book a couple of times in sort of like supporting your own theories. But you look like a young man. I didn't look it up. I probably should have done. But do you actually remember that era of Labour, or have you grown up with it from a sort of, I suppose, the Blairite era?
No, I remember the early 80s. I was born in 74. I remember the early 80s. I remember the 83 election vaguely, when Thatcher annihilated the Labour Party under Michael Foot. I remember my dad griping at the TV the next morning when he got up and saw the result. So I was sort of interested politically from quite an early age, and I joined the party in 1994. And I would say that the change in the demographic of the party itself and the outlook, the ideology of the party has been noticeable even since that time, since the mid-90s. And actually, I would say particularly in the last 15 years. I mean, I go to Labour Party conference most years. I'm active in the Labour movement. I'm an active trade unionist. And I just think it's obvious looking from the inside, which is where I am. What's changed is the movement itself has become far more kind of middle class, far more based in the cities, far more kind of built around the precepts of cosmopolitan liberalism. And
as you've said in the title of your book, it's not just that that's the new focus, but that they actively and explicitly disavow and despise the old focus, right?
This is exactly the point, because what I argue is that the Labour Party was always historically an electoral compromise. I mean, it wasn't ever exclusively blue-collar working class, and I wouldn't particularly want it to be. You know, if you're going to be successful electorally, you've got to reach out to a layer of middle-class, white-collar people. And actually, at its best, the Labour Party did that. But it always understood, I think, that its reason for existence was to represent the less fortunate in society, the poorest.
Because the funny thing, people forget this, I think, about the Blair era, this is a classic sort of example of how history works, but you'll remember it, Ian. That was Prescott. George Prescott was a significant member in that cabinet and in that first, and I mean, he was as old school as it comes, right? And there was always that sense that Prescott sort of anchored. He reminded me a little bit of the way that in American politics there's always this kind of north-south divide, and somebody like Kennedy needs to have Johnson. You need to have somebody who brings the South with you.
Exactly that. It was exactly that. And Prescott, I'll never forgive Prescott. When Prescott was brought on as the kind of credential, there's Tony Blair mincing around on stage, and there's John Prescott, the lumbering working class representative, the burly union guy, literally from the 20th century. Prescott, you remember, said that we're all middle class now. Yeah. Prescott, you will remember, not only accepted the legacy of Blair's PFI program, but accelerated and intensified it. So it's ridiculous. I mean, he just sold everything down the river, I think. Prescott's an asshole.
And he didn't carry himself with a great deal of personal dignity and grace either, did it?
I mean, he could punch a mullet.
Yeah.
And
dodge an egg.
Is that a euphemism for something?
Oh no!
I'd like to know what it is.
He also shagged his secretary, so I
thought that's what you meant. I thought that's what you meant with the punch.
Let's park the adultery. And no, remember he punched that guy. It's good.
Yeah.
It was a good punch, John. That was John being John, wasn't it? He was a classic example in a way of that thing. I read a book recently. I don't know if this is a guy that either of you know, Christopher Lasch. Have you heard of him? He's an American social critic, really interesting writer. Died in the 20th century, but his stuff is still worth reading. He talked about the kind of the deceptive, what would you call it, the dissembling sort of emoluments of meritocracy, the idea that we have social mobility and that's the great measure of society. As long as you can rise from lowly origins to take your place in the higher echelons of society, everything's working fine. And it's like, that wasn't the point. That's not supposed to be the great American project. The great American project was, it doesn't matter where you live and at what tier of society you remain, you are respected and considered a worthwhile member of society. All meritocracy does is allow that, a continued new sort of blood transplants to what would otherwise become an exhausted elite. It's not.
And there's a contempt as well, I think, for the old concepts of vocation and the old concepts of kind of skilled blue collar work. I mean, I don't know if you saw it, but Liz Kendall was trending on Twitter last night because she gave a speech in the Commons yesterday. And she was talking about how badly we treat care workers. And she said something along the lines of, you get paid more stacking the shelves at Morrison's now than you do as a care worker. And in our country, that's completely unacceptable. Now, I know the point that she was making, but why disparage people who stack the shelves? These people have been keeping our society going over the last year or so. And it's the old, I mean, I went to Catholic school, and it's the old concept of the dignity of labour, which I think is a really important concept, that no matter how you work, no matter how much you're paid, no matter what your status, if you work full stop and you contribute to society, then your job is as equal as anybody else's, and your status should be treated as equal as anybody else's. But we completely downgraded that.
It's not just downgraded. It's kind of it's inverted the relationship between the classes. I mean, where you find the dignity of labour talked about most fulsomely now is a middle-class lunch where people rave about this Polish plasterer they've got, who does such a lovely job. because I couldn't do anything like that, and how clever they are with their hands.
Yeah,
but the thing is, Ian, I think what we find is if their own kids were to talk about becoming a plumber or a brickie or a Sparks or something like that, they'd probably be horrified, because we've kind of got this idea, and a lot of it came with Blair, I think, with 50% of kids must go through university and whatever. Yeah. It's almost like we're disparaging towards the idea of vocation, blue collar work, which actually in many cases is skilled work. And
it's really interesting, that point, actually, Paul, about Tony Blair's great campaign to get as many kids as possible into university. And that was seen as a way, I think, wasn't it, of shifting the vote in Labour's direction, apart from anything else. I mean, I hate to sort of project cynical demographic shifts onto a policy that might well have been just like, wouldn't it be lovely if everyone had a degree? But there was a sort of understanding that metropolitan elites, generally speaking, vote left. But actually what he created was, as you say, a kind of contempt for anyone who didn't have a degree. You swung the balance of probability so far in the direction of having one that anyone who had just gone, no, I'm going to be a plumber, well, it was sort of like a bit below everyone's dignity.
There was a lot of guff at the time talked about the knowledge economy, and I think the bold and rather simplistic idea that you could secure Britain's place in the future as a future of a knowledge-based economy by sending half the young people to university. I mean, a lot of people, including me, at the time wondered why he was doing it, and I just think he did it because he could, because he, as you say, he wanted to create.
I mean, what have been the outcomes for? I mean, I know young kids who were sort of crammed into universities in line with that proposal by Blair, and have kind of come out the other side, and not unintelligent by any stretch of the imagination, but the degree has proved in many respects, I think, worthless, because some of these youngsters are working in McDonald's, or they're working in other shops, and I'm certainly not, doing what I said before, downgrading that. But my point would be, well, you wouldn't have needed to go through university to do that. You wouldn't have needed to saddle yourself with debt. So what was the point in putting?
That's the key, isn't it? The debt. I mean, nobody would otherwise begrudge them 3 years of partying. University can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, but that's grow as a person. That's a middle class tradition. Yeah. I mean, my nephew was going to be the first one in the family, in the Essex bit of the family, to go to college. And there were two things that stopped him, which is the working class culture that I left, is you don't get in debt. Debt is a terrible thing. It's a shame to have hanging around your neck. And also, all his mates thought it was gay. So, and he got very little support from his parents. But that's another story. But
I mean, you could argue that Thatcher, I suppose, or that era was the first era to work on to kind of erode the horror of debt. The idea of debt as a moral failing was basically just dissolved, wasn't it, in the first wave of neoliberalism? Yeah. So that's not a left-wing, right-wing thing, or maybe it was, I don't know, but it continues in that. And I suppose they would say, well, you're investing in yourself, but the statistics just don't bear it out.
And it's a great disciplinary tool as well. If you're saddled with debt, be it in the form of a mortgage or tuition fees that you've got to pay back, you're less likely, I think, to want to rock the boat or to do anything that could lead to the destruction of your livelihood, because you've got to, you're saddled with this debt. And,
that's true.
Tony Benn used to talk about debt as a disciplinary tool, and I think he was on to.
Well, it's interesting that it can be. I mean, it goes all the way back to Lenin and debauching the currency as well, doesn't it? A lot of big left-wing thinkers have always understood that what the pressures you can exert through fairly large macroeconomic forces are, that most ordinary people don't really think in those terms, and it's quite difficult actually to activate or to gather support or to build a coalition talking in those terms, because most people's minds just fade out.
If you come from your family background is not further in higher education, then the idea that you would leave college, and he was planning to do a vocational course in sport, degree in sport, whatever, teaching. But the idea that you could come out of that the other side, I mean, someone's 30 grand, and with the interest, I mean, it's just a terrifying thought. if you've never had that level of debt. And I think it's much more scary if you haven't got the money. It always has been.
And you should never, like, of course, speak of that in the same breath as a mortgage, because a mortgage can tie you down, but a mortgage is a leveraged investment in an asset class that has only ever really ridden over long term, and is actually the only way most ordinary people get a chance to build some equity.
Well, in the old days, of course, it was the other way around, right?
It's a different thing, absolutely,
It's proper social housing, properly designed, properly built.
If I had to pick one
an
word
argument for closing down half the universities and turning them into vocational colleges. That would be, if I were Prime Minister for a day, that would be one of the things that
it sounds fine to me. I have no problem with that. It seems like a proper move that would indeed give dignity to Labour, and I think we've lost all that, as you say.
There are some people, I wish I could remember names. There's one guy who wrote a book that's literally called Why Office Work is Bad for You and Doing Things with Your Hands will enhance mental health or something. It's some absurdly long-winded and sort of prosaic title. But he talks about, it could be. He himself had been a corporate lawyer, and he gave it up and started working in a bicycle maintenance workshop. It's a bit like sort of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but as a sort of policy document. A very impressive book. And he basically talks about the degree of satisfaction he gets at the end of the day when he sees a customer ride off on a motorbike that wasn't working, which he never ever got as after a day of working on a pro forma contract for some, faceless entity that he couldn't give a damn about.
Don't we all get that? Except Paul probably gets it in reverse. I mean, because
putting out the fire.
Well, no, he's got a proper job. So I'm wondering if he'll lean back after banging out a 850 word piece for Unheard. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Writing.
There is something terribly addictive, isn't there, about giving your opinion and feeling that it's being listened to?
I think with, it feeds into this debate about, the future of work, automation, artificial intelligence, where it's going to lead us in the future, whether that's going to move us to the type of economy where we're just basically giving people free money under kind of universal basic income or something. And I think that's actually something we need to think hard about, because exactly what you were saying there, Simon, the sense of reward that people often get through work, to kind of downgrade it, I think, risks the sort of fabric of society in many respects, and what binds us together, and the happiness and the reward that people often feel through contribute. It's an entry point often for people into society and contributing to society. And so even on the left, someone on the left, I'm wary about this debate around universal basic income, where we want to move to almost like a workless society where we just give people money, and, the dangers of that, I don't think we've addressed that.
There's always this kind of circular argument about, okay, but where are the jobs going to come from now that we've lost our manufacturing base and whatnot? And as a member, as a state pensioner myself, I can tell you that the prospect of an aging population doesn't bode well for a care industry that is almost entirely owned by private sector. And once again, all the money over the last, for as long as I can remember now, it seems like forever, all the money has been going from taxpayers to shareholders. Every year, all the wealth is being sucked out. But if you're looking for a sector that requires an expansion of people working in it, then care industry, surely.
Yeah.
Thousands of more jobs are required.
And I think what COVID and the fallout from it is I hope is going to do is just force us to reassess the economy that we want. First of all, to understand the importance of a national economy, that you can't just rely on global supply chains. We saw some of the problems that materialized around PPE and stuff like that. That actually, the nation state does matter, and national economy does matter. And, in order to get through the COVID fallout economically, the last thing we want, in my view, is to employ the same kind of remedies that Cameron employed in terms of, a decade of austerity. It was almost like, I think, that much of the West, including the leaders in our own country, forgot the lessons of the 30s, that actually you can't cut your way out of a recession. You end up making the situation worse. You end up leading to a depression potentially. And that what you need to do is kind of grow your way out, and you can't do that by slashing and burning.
So you're saying major European war is what we need now?
I wouldn't go quite that far, although it looks like it's kicking off in Ukraine. But you know, I think that's going to be a big debate for the Tories, actually, because if you look, I mean, you think of the Tories, you know, they won, as we touched on earlier, they won, you know, huge chunks of the red wall at the election in 2019. Now, those people, I think, in those communities are only going to do that. They're only going to vote for the Tories again if they believe their lives have been tangibly improved in terms of investment in their communities, jobs, etc. If the Tories just basically say no, you know, we need another decade of austerity in order to pay for the COVID crisis, then I'm pretty sure those people are not going to vote Tory again. The calculation for the Tories is: do we go with our natural instincts, which is, you know, to you know, neoliberalism and cuts, etc., or do we, for electoral reasons, say no? Actually, we need to throw money at these communities, regardless of the economic situation. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out, I think.
Yeah, those votes are for rent, aren't they? Go on, him.
Paul, do you think that I mean, the sort of COVID fallout, although it was quite interesting, that this minefield of open borders or controlled borders suddenly went out the window. There's COVID there. Everyone's going, right, shut it all up and find out what's
medieval city.
And I just wonder if you thought that another byproduct of COVID might be to have a dispassionate look at borders, at your nation state idea about what's coming in and out and so on.
I suspect that won't happen, because I think the issue has become so binary, the issue of borders now, that I think as the restrictions ease, I think people will just retreat to their original positions. And I think that, you know, the sad thing is, Ian, and I kind of addressed this in the recent book, that I think we were making so many advances on the issue of race and immigration in this country. I mean, you only have to go back to the 70s, as you two will know. The National Front were on the march and they were standing in elections, and we had race rights and stuff. And I think we've made great strides. But I think because people feel that on the question of borders, that their trust was abused and that the system basically became out of control, and it wasn't managed properly. And all of a sudden, particularly I think in the first decade of this century, where you saw the real acute effects of globalization in terms of free movement and deindustrialization, rapid demographic change, all of this kind of stuff, it's almost like it's poisoned that issue again. And instead of taking the sensible part, I mean, I'm pro-immigration, and I think without question it's brought benefits, but I think if you're going to get the best out of it, you need to manage it properly. And I think most people in this country actually think that. But the sad thing is, I think because they were told, actually, you know, this policy of open borders and free movement is to the benefit of the country, give you a bit of extra money in your wage packet each month because GDP will go up. Never mind about those ideas about, you know, your sense of place and belonging and the fact that you don't particularly want change imposed on you too quickly. And it's become poisoned, and it's become a running sore again.
Although there is a sense since Brexit certainly was concluded that the British are a lot less heated on this subject now. A lot of polls suggesting that immigration is sliding back down again in terms of issues that they think very much about. I think you're absolutely right that they were mainly concerned that nobody seemed to have any kind of clue what was going on. It was just like a gushing water main, wasn't it? That was the fear. Not so much that somebody was controlling the tap and had decided to turn it up. It was like there isn't, you know. I mean, this is what I find fascinating about politics. On the one hand, there are all kinds of clever arguments you can make about what policy will have what effect. But the law of unintended consequences seems to be the most iron law of any. And if any one person was responsible for Brexit, I would say it was probably Tony Blair, you know, with the level of immigration that he encouraged and then denied was going on, made people think that there was some kind of weird gaslighting. They didn't use that term then, but that was kind of what people thought was what was going on. Go on, Ian.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Paul makes this point in his book about globalization and what a stupid idea, you know, what a simplistic idea it is. But you know, you can't globalization. If you're an egalitarian, if you're a socialist, I mean, the whole idea of globalization is fine as long as you've got a universal minimum wage. So it doesn't make any sense to move from Bengal to Berkhamsted and also follow the unions. I mean, it's always been it is always, even when I disagree with them. I mean, the unions had a correct position on Brexit. which is the EU as a capitalist cartel, and they had the correct view on cheap labour, which is to undercut any unionised indigenous labour, and it's just the bosses exploiting the system. I think that's the way to. That would be the way to frame it.
What I find bizarre is that until fairly recently, the idea of controlling the labour supply was a mainstream position on the left. You know, trade unionists and socialists would have no hesitation in saying, yeah, the labour supply is a market dynamic, and it's got the ability to affect wages, it's got the ability to affect employment levels. And therefore, as with all market dynamics, we should regulate it so as to make sure it's managed properly and we can get the best condition for workers. But it's almost now, it's a fringe position on the left now. If you say, actually, I believe in control of the labour supply, I don't believe in open borders, people will look at you. A position that until recently, open borders was held largely on the left by Trotskyists and anarchists, is now seen as the mainstream position, and regulation of the labour supply is seen as a crank position. And there was, I refer to it in the book, you know, there was, it's a two-way thing. And you mentioned about the Bengal Berkhamsted thing, and I think it's absolutely right. If you have a system of free movement between highly diverse economies, then inevitably most of the movement will be from the low wage economies to the high wage economies. Now, what that does is obviously in certain sectors that will lead to an oversupply of labour, such as construction and retail, hospitality, etc., and exert downward pressure on the wages of the host country. But one point that a lot of people fail to ever understand is the impact on the parent country. So, for example, in The Guardian, a year or two ago, there was an article about how the Romanian health service was facing a crisis as a result of the number of doctors who had moved abroad after EU accession in 2004. Latvia has lost something like a quarter of its working population. So actually, that sort of highly diverse thing where you have free movement between the two leads to problems in both types of economy. But people don't want to discuss it.
No, I saw a foreign policy expert from Bulgaria talking about this. As quite a sort of fringe meeting I was invited to once, but it was really fascinating because nobody has ever bothered, as far as I know, to think about it from their point of view. Everyone thought the Bulgarian-Romania thing was just a Farage talking point, you know, trying to cook up some kind of fear of some, I don't know, like criminal gangs or something, it was his xenophobic take on what was happening, and completely ignored the effect that it was going to have. Bulgaria has been so hollowed out now, it's like North Dakota or something, you know, as far as they're concerned, and people within America probably take it for granted that if you're born smart and ambitious in North Dakota, you leave as soon as you're, you know, legally able to drive, and you never go back.
And the same thing, you know, we often see politicians, and I understand completely why they do it. You know, politicians will talk about the number of immigrants who work in the National Health Service, and you sometimes see these graphics with all of the countries listed where health workers have come to Britain from all of these countries and the number that have come. And it's wonderful. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, that, you know, the people in the NHS do a fantastic job, and we should praise them to the skies. But I just wonder if anybody thinks sometimes, actually, when you list all of those countries and the thousands and thousands of people who are working in Britain's health service, what does that mean for those often poor countries that are trying to develop their own health services? Every time they train someone up, they just see people flooding abroad. I mean, the impact that that's having in those countries, again, just isn't talked about.
Well, as a metropolitan liberal elitist, let me say that I welcome all the graphics and the narrative about our multiracial NHS, because even in somewhere like Lancaster, where I live, which is a university town and which has got more culturally diverse over the last 30 years, still it remains predominantly white. And when you go into hospital, it's not predominantly white. It's a different, the only time you see that spread of people all working hard is inside the infirmary.
Yeah, interesting. Let me bring in a slightly different topic, although it will all sort of join up. Family, which I think is quite important to your sort of thesis, Paul, in your book, and the sense that family is a unit of social organization, which the modern left, if not, is not one of the things it despises. It certainly doesn't regard it as being sort of worth protecting in its own right. I feel that's something that is maybe where people have lost a lot of contact, and a sense of support has been lost, because family for people on what you describe in the book, the sort of socially conservative but economically liberal, the redistributive but hang the pedos kind of left of the red wall, were they organized themselves along family lines, and yet modern sort of left-wing theorists regard the family as a unit of patriarchal oppression. I mean, I'm obviously overstepping the line there a little bit, and going into that slightly sort of, so it's a slightly satirical take on it, but there is a degree to which it's seen as quite an old-fashioned thing. I mean, that seems to me where part of the coalition is breaking down.
I sort of make the case in the book that I think it's a straightforward case. Look, family, first of all, I think, is the place where people first learn some of the really important lessons of life, where they learn solidarity. It's where they learn about compassion. It's where they learn about love. It's where they learn about rules. It's where they learn about discipline. It's where they learn about loyalty to their fellow man. And I sort of say in the book that one of the weird things about the left's kind of dismissal nowadays, and contempt in some cases for the family unit, is I kind of see family as something a bit like socialism in action, really. We're all together, we share, we look after each other, we've got each other's backs. And then when you look at the issue of family breakdown, and I don't come at it from a sort of right-wing perspective, stop payments to single mothers and all that sort of nonsense. I just simply make the case that when you do look, every study has shown that where kids are brought up in a stable two-family home, invariably their life chances are better. They achieve better outcomes in terms of education, in terms of job opportunities. And where they're not brought up where they're brought up in broken homes, then there's a greater likelihood they're going to suffer negative outcomes, turn to drugs, do worse at school, turn to alcohol, turn to crime, all this sort of stuff. Now, if we on the left are genuine about representing the less fortunate in society, why don't we just make the case for the family and say, actually, if we're about improving the life chances of people, let's try to develop a culture and a system where we encourage families to stay together as much as possible. I'm not saying you should force people. Of course, you can't force people to stay together. But we take such a blasé attitude now. Well, if families break down, well, that's life. Let's not worry about it. Let's not stigmatize families that break down. And I just
that's the thing, isn't it? A reluctance to stigmatise and to shame. I wonder what you think about that, Ian, because I know you are personally quite a strong family man, but it's obviously not something a government.
People don't do it. I mean, I'm with the same person I've been with for 48 years, and a lot of my peers are the same. They're in long-term relationships. I think it's going to be a bit like putting the genie back in the bottle, though. I mean, if you're reinforcing the idea that a traditional nuclear family is the model, you've then got to, Paul, I just don't know how you do that. I mean, without making it illegal. I don't know. It's because of the nature of work, because of the nature of the gig economy, and all sorts of stuff that have liberated women from being in a patriarchal family setting. I don't see how.
It is tricky. I mean, there are financial levers you can pull, I guess, but you don't have to make them moral.
How you get that back, and I don't think saying it's okay, whatever makeup you have behind the front door.
Because I've noticed one thing that seems to correlate closely with it, and this is, I don't know, I may even be out of line here, so feel free to correct me if I am, but I think it correlates closely with the sort of the dissolution of faith. And I'm not religious myself, and I wasn't brought up religious, so this is just like an external observation and not a prescriptive one. But it seems that faith and strong family structure do kind of walk side by side a lot, and that a lot of the immigrant populations in this country, which bring their faith with them, manage to sustain stronger faith structure, stronger family structures as a result, and often have larger families as a result as well, which I personally think is healthy. I mean, in my mind, the kind of like the really healthy society is not really nuclear families. It's more like extended families, really. I do have a lot of kind of time for that kind of it takes a village thing. I would love it if everyone was throwing their front doors open in the morning and the kids were milling around outside. Do you know what I mean? That kind of, I mean, I know that's totally, but that's my utopia.
I do. Sorry, Paul.
No, you go. Sorry.
I was just saying. What I found was very interesting in your book, Paul, was that you made a case for the nation state and the idea of owning your borders and being responsible for what happened inside and detaching from globalization and rebuilding industries and all that stuff. I mean, that appeals. At one end, you've got the nation state. At the other end, you've got sort of neighborhood communities. And I think there's, that deals with one set of stuff, and this deals with another set of stuff. And I think the hope that the Labour Party should have is in its local network. Every time there's an election, we're out posting shit through the letterboxes and everything, and it's always
not literally.
Only
to Tory voters.
Only there's a Tory sign in the front garden.
Those days have gone.
Those days have not gone. What I'm saying is that another thing that COVID's shown us, surely, is that you can bung out 42 billion to your mates, and you can energize the local authority and the NHS, local NHS, to roll out these vaccines extremely effectively and call in volunteers really easily. The whole thing's been absolutely energizing for me. I mean, I've had my first one, next one's booked for a couple of weeks. I'm really looking forward to it. And there's something about Labour and Labour's work at local level, I think, kind of gets missed in all these debates about what's the national view on gender identity, or what's the national view on globalization or whatever. I think Labour's hope, it seems to me, is it's grassroots stuff. I don't know.
I mean, I love the Labour movement, and I love, as I said, I love the Labour Party. I've been in it for 26 years. There are many thousands of good people who do work that goes, as there are in all political parties.
Yeah,
who work that goes unrecognised, and they tramp the streets in order to try to win local elections and go out on the knocker and stuff like that. I think the problem is the party needs a radical overhaul. I think without question it's lost touch with its base. And when we talk about the coalition, I always talk about the Hartlepool-Hampstead coalition. Hartlepool obviously relevant to the by-election at the moment, where it's always at its best. It's always been that blue-collar Hartlepool. That's really why we exist. But equally, we're very happy to attract a layer of middle-class liberals from Hampstead who want to see a more egalitarian society and economy. The problem, I think, Ian, is that pendulum has shifted so decisively towards that latter group over the last sort of 20 years or so. And I think what they did is they just assumed that the working class, the blue collar vote, would have nowhere else to go. So they said, look, what we need to do, Blair said in the 90s, what we need to do, let's capture Middle England. The working class will always stay with us. And for a while they did. But then all of a sudden you had the real acute impacts of globalisation in the first decade, I think, of this century, particularly in communities like mine in Barking and Dagenham. I mean, it was profound, the impact. Ford's virtually closing and production being shipped abroad, and the sort of rapid demographic change. And then when you had the global financial crash and austerity, I think my dog's just about to bark, apologies if he does, then all of a sudden people did start to look elsewhere. Millions of them started to abstain. Some of them were attracted to the BNP. BNP won 12 seats in my borough in 2006. Some of them went to UKIP. And Labour looked back and thought, oh, bugger, actually, perhaps these people are not going to stay with us. And they haven't won, millions of them haven't gone back to Labour.
That's always the thing, isn't it? You have to build, if a two-party system, same in America, you have to build coalitions, and there's always going to be a calculation whose vote can we rely on, because they haven't got anywhere else to go. I think that's what the Republican Party did a lot with the Rust Belt, right? They didn't really do anything for them. They just assumed that on the basis of God's guns and abortions, there was not going to be anywhere else that they could go. Well, they didn't actually have to leave the Republican Party. They just installed their own. Trump was essentially like a kind of coup of the Republican Party from that point of view.
I mean, you mentioned Hartlepool, Paul. I thought it was quite interesting because, I mean, Mandelson is known for two things, really. One is going to a chippy in Hartlepool, pointing at some mushy peas and saying, I'll have some guacamole. Which
he denies that, but I can well believe it, actually.
Yeah, we all want to believe it because, it plays into it plays into his character. And the other thing he's famous for is that quote, that you partially quote, where he says he's
filthy rich,
intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich.
Yeah.
That's not where the quote ended, Paul, is it? The quote ended, as long as they pay their taxes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think the interesting thing about that, and I think I link it to a famous interview that Blair did with Jeremy Paxman, where Paxman asked him a number of times whether he was happy that the gap between rich and poor under Labour had grown wider. And as I say in the book, Blair sort of went through all manner of contortions to avoid saying no, he wasn't happy about that and he wanted to close the gap. And what he relied on in the end was the Thatcherite argument, where she used to say, well, as long as people at the bottom are improving their lot, then I'm quite happy for people at the top to improve their lot by even more. I'm not worried about the gap, just as long as people at the bottom are getting a bit more. But I think that misses the point that actually, if you do have these enormous gaps between rich and poor, then actually, even if the poor are slowly sort of increasing their prosperity every year, you're just creating these wide social problems.
Yeah.
Economically, I don't think it's particularly wise. Politically, I don't think it's wise for wealth to be concentrated in fewer and fewer hands.
Well, of course,
and I think it just creates all sorts of social problems when you have great gaps between rich and poor in that way.
You're right, and also the word "filthy rich" sort of disowns the second part of that anyway. The whole idea of being filthy rich is that there is something immoral about it, isn't it? I mean,
I thought he fronted it out well, as it turns out. But like Paul, everybody just quotes the first part of the. I think the question was, how can you live with yourself when you, under Labour, people are becoming filthy rich?
Yeah, right.
I think the question was fed to him. I may be wrong, but I mean the taxes thing. We're letting people off of taxes left, right, and centre. Bloody Bahamas and fuck off. Come on. What was I going to say? Blair. Yes, the Blair. Like this whole offloading everything, the contracting out. You build a hospital and the local authority will owe you for the next 100 years. And if it goes wrong, that's just your fault. All that stuff was terrible. But there was a kind of moral offloading as well, well before the Iraq war, where he said basically the mantra was, whatever works. And in his view, if you could get a public procurement system that worked, i.e. you were getting schools built, then that's fine. There's no moral dimension to whether or not the shareholders of the company that was building those schools should get rich rather than the taxpayers of this country. It does my head in to this day.
And what I find interesting as well, you mentioned about the issue of taxes and I always find it interesting how people, and this was a trap that I think New Labour fell into, where they say, actually, we've got to create the best conditions in terms of low tax, low regulation to attract businesses and to keep businesses here, because if we don't do that, then the businesses will take they'll go elsewhere, they'll move abroad. And okay, but isn't it funny how that argument that's used is effectively a sort of form of blackmail, really?
Yeah.
And multinationals do it all the time. They say, unless you give us a sort of tax regime and regulatory regime we demand, then we'll go to the Far East and we'll invest there and someone else will get the benefit of it, which has a real impact in terms of democracy in the first place. The idea that multinationals now exert so much power over nationally elected governments, but they never use that same defence when it comes to workers demanding a better rate of pay. I've been on strike a few times as a firefighter. If I go on strike as a firefighter and I say, I'm doing it for more money. If you don't pay it, we're going to go on strike. We're holding the country to ransom. Workers are holding the country to ransom. But when it's businesses doing it, we've got to indulge them. This is how the world works. And Labour bought a lot of that, and I think
it did, and it's just depressing seeing that narrative every time anyone's on strike for anything. From a time I was a teenager, 50 odd years. It's the same. It's a right-wing press, obviously. It's conservative press.
It's also, I think, if it's the public sector, it's a function to some extent of the fiat currency sort of delusion, isn't it? Money is now a sort of conjurer's trick and has been for some time now. And there is constantly the magic money tree just rings hollow for a lot of people, that phrase, that idea that apparently there is,
Yeah. If you Dido Harding, there is a money tree, apparently.
Yeah.
Well, this is a thing, isn't it? You know, when constantly, you know, the public sector and others are told, no, there isn't money for pay rises, there's not money for investment. But when push comes to shove, you know, when we want to go to war in Iraq or whatever, you know, there's suddenly a bottomless pit of money.
Well, where to be fair, Paul, when they wanted, before the COVID pandemic, in that tiny window that they had between being re-elected in December 2019 and the pandemic overwhelming everything, they indicated that they were willing to access the magic money tree in order to shore up the red wall vote. You know, they were willing to support and reward that initially. But I think there's something, and I don't want to keep coming back to the faith thing, but I think there's also, it doesn't really matter economically. The fact is, over, you know, decades, probably even hundreds of years, to the extent that statistics exist, there doesn't really seem to be a significant rise in reported levels of happiness as people's economic sort of absolute conditions have improved. There is something sentimental. There's something about what project are we part of? What kind of country are we? You know, and people don't seem to be willing to talk about that, but it's kind of as above, so below. That really should be the guiding principle, I think.
I don't know. I mean, I'm an old-fashioned guy and an Anglican, and you know, I go to church for all sorts of reasons, for the reassurance and the ritual and everything. And for the two reasons that anyone goes to church, you say thank you and you say sorry.
Yeah.
And I don't think people do enough of either at the moment, but I'm not sure that's much to do with faith. I think it's your mind.
Well, what I mean by the faith thing, and I totally agree with what you just said, and saying thank you in particular is an incredibly, like, I mean, I think it's the single greatest tool for self-care that I've ever discovered. Consciously expressing gratitude. It sounds really wet and what
yeah.
I think you associate with me maybe, but anyway, I do it. But what I mean is, if you get like Gilded Age levels of inequality, if you can see that certain corporations or international finance and capital is being excused from the rules that apply to other people, it doesn't really matter if it means that there are slightly more jobs or there's a little bit more money coming in. You know it's wrong. Everyone knows it's wrong. You just sense it. It's like we should trust our instincts a little bit more and revert less to tabular, you know, statistical demonstrations that actually you'll find that because we're allowing companies to exist here without paying their taxes, that, you know, there's a couple more jobs available.
Well, and I think that one of the mistakes the Labour Party has made in recent years, I think, was in believing the slogan that it's all about the economy, stupid. In other words, if all it will take really to win the working class over, you know, these communities that have been really impacted by globalization in a big way. If we just promise them a bit of free money, if we talk to them about GDP figures, and, you know, we talk to them about universal basic income, and all of these kind of radical economic ideas, then they'll come flocking back to us. Now, I think that was completely destroyed. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm someone on the left, I'm very much in favour of redistribution of wealth, but it's not all that people care about in these communities. If it was, then, you know, Labour went to the polls in 2017 with arguably the most radical redistributive manifesto in recent memory, and then again in 2019. And in 2019, they didn't win in 2017, and in 2019, they got absolutely smashed. So the idea that all we have to do is promise them money, this sort of Thatcherite argument is, you know, all people are interested in is making a fast buck.
That was the best, it's the best manifesto I've ever seen in my life. The one, the 2017 manifesto was a manifesto I've been waiting for all my life. And I loved the mischief that Corbyn had initially created. I loved the way he was upsetting people I didn't like particularly. I loved the polarization that he brought. And then, having delivered quite a good result in 2017, he should have stepped down. But after that, it became, you know, it's not about me, it's about the movement. It wasn't. It was about the movement. It wasn't about, you know, and he stayed on. And it was the biggest tactical error the Labour Party's made for years.
That's quite interesting. Yeah.
I think in many ways, Ian, I mean, I'll probably slightly part from you on 2017. I mean, I think that the relative success of Labour's election in 2017, and I say relative success because let's not forget, after 7 years of Tory government or Tory coalition and then Tory government, during which they had imposed crippling austerity in many communities, Labour still couldn't win after 7 years. But because because Labour did much better than people were expecting, it was painted as a victory, really, when it wasn't. And I think in many respects, that was almost the worst thing. You know, I voted Labour, but it was almost the worst thing to happen, because had Labour been smashed at that election in the way it was in 2019, you wouldn't have then had, you know, the second referendum Brexit policy.
Well, this is really the exact perfect example of the unintended consequences. I tend to agree with Ian. I'm not a socialist, but I could totally see why the Corbyn manifesto, you know, caught everyone blindside. It obviously created a much greater wave of approval than anyone expected. But all the ultimate result was that it completely hobbled Theresa May's attempts to get Brexit through, which made everyone utterly exasperated 2 years later. And in comes Boris Johnson with a vast majority, which was basically there to just, oh, will you please get Brexit done once and for all? So all of that amazing kind of support and momentum for a socialist policy really basically gave Boris Johnson a huge majority. I mean, it's horrible how these things happen, but that's what happened.
You're like every bloody person on Twitter telling me what it's like. Telling me what the Beatles were like, you know. You're like every bastard fucking 35-year-old saying, oh, well, of course, you know, John and George are doing this because in 2 years' time, they'd release Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Fuck off. Look, the whole point is that we're in the thinking moment. We don't know what's coming next.
Oh, I know.
Please, Peter, just let me fucking have that moment acceleration 2017 where we were expecting to be wiped out and suddenly we weren't.
But I'll give you an example from the other side. In 1992 it was much better for the Tories to have lost in 92. Much better. They had an absolute fucking car crash. Winning in 92 was the worst thing that happened to them.
I wonder.
Well, six months later we had Black Wednesday, didn't we?
Exactly, you know, and that was the end of it.
Whereas if that was the end. That was Black Wednesday.
If that would have been a hospital pass to the Labour Party, they wouldn't have left
maybe.
ERM or coped any better. So, you know.
Yeah, and then the truth is, at that time, although the Labour Party made huge capital out of the ERM withdrawal and interest rates going up to 15% and all the rest of it, Labour had basically the same policy on the ERM. And as you say, that they would have been, and you imagine the stick that a Labour government would
would have ended them.
It would have ended them.
We're probably winding up quite soon. I mean, we can carry on drinking and talking, but I should probably bring the sort of formal discussion to some sort of conclusion. Do you think?
Still coherent.
I sometimes wonder if, I mean, I don't know what, like the paucity of examples I have from my own understanding of political history. Are we like seeing like what we saw 100 years ago with the end of the Whigs? You know, are we seeing like what we saw in America, where the Republican Party sort of had some massive convulsion? A lot of people, and I don't know necessarily, will I agree, but they would say the Tory party in this country is much closer to the Democratic Party in America, and the Republican Party and the Labour Party are both these ones which are sort of struggling to make any sort of sense. The Democrats and the Tories have this kind of unified sort of, it's a chrome-covered fucking mess, in truth. You know, it's highly business-oriented, it's corporatist, it's crony capitalism at its worst, but it has this kind of, it's controlling the message and it's controlling the agenda and it's driving forward like an unstoppable bloody all-black pack at the moment. And, you know, what can you do against those things? Is there going to be some change, some split? Will there emerge a socially conservative, economically liberal party which will reassert dominance in Scotland and take it away from these nationalist, delusionist fuckwits? Or is there going to be something that, you know, is it just going to be a disintegration of the fringes and hegemony for the blues?
I think that's, I mean, like I say on that, I think that's I think, as the old phrase goes, the tectonic plates are potentially shifting. I mean, even if you go back to a comparable election in '83 when Labour was hammered by Thatcher under Michael Foot, I mean, it could still be argued that even though it was a bad defeat for Labour, they didn't lose anything like the number of sort of red wall seats that they lost in 2019. And the Labour Party, even then, was still an object of affection for large parts of the working class. I think now when you go to some of these communities, you go to my old community in Barking and Dagenham, in many cases, there's a visceral hatred for the Labour Party now in the way that there wasn't necessarily in '83. And I think that's because of the change in the Labour Party itself, the fact that it's grown so far away from the working class and actively seems to despise those sort of working class values. I think it's the fact that people feel that they don't speak for them anymore. They don't share their priorities. I think the Brexit thing was huge. I still don't think the Labour Party has understood the damage that in the end, not respecting the Brexit, whatever people's views on Brexit, the Labour Party's message to working class communities who had voted in that referendum in good faith and in huge numbers, that they got it wrong and must do it again. That could be permanent, that damage. I don't think the Labour Party understands that. That hurt people so much and angered people so much. That could be permanent. And look where we are now. We're 2 years, well, 18 months, whatever it is, into the next Tory government. Just been through a massive COVID crisis, and the government hasn't, aside from the vaccine rollout, which has been very good, the government didn't perform particularly well. And yet they are still surging in the polls. And Labour is now potentially likely to lose Hartlepool, a seat that it already held in the Red Wall. So I genuinely think, and it pains me to say it, I think there is a danger that Labour has lost the working class for good. I don't rule out that possibility.
I wouldn't rule it out either. What's interesting, though, to me, is that years ago, before Corbyn, I thought there was a glimmer of hope in Angela Rayner, and I'll tell you why. Because nobody likes tribal division like the Labour Party. Nobody likes schism like the Labour Party. And for years it's been, oh, you're a Blairite. Oh, you're a radical. Well, we don't get on. Fuck you. Well, yeah, don't start me on trans. All this stuff. And she was theoretically brilliant because she was to the left, but also she'd been one of the early beneficiaries of the Sure Start system that Tony Blair set up in his first year. And to my mind, one of the crowning glories of proper socialist revival. It was such a brilliant idea. And that was the last good thing he did. It was only about 10 months into his thing. Anyway, whatever. So she got pregnant at 16. She left school. She was a young mother, bewildered, skint. And Sure Start really so she can't really have a go at Blair in the way that people who don't like Blair can have a go at Blair. And yet she can be radical in a way. And I thought, that's the kind of person we want as deputy leader. She's the Prescott for today. And I've noticed that she's been very quiet, and you think it's because people are keeping her quiet. But I think she's actually probably got a lot of really good stuff to say. She's like,
and the thing is, Ian, as well, there's an authenticity about her.
Totally.
She can genuinely say she comes from that working class background. She can resonate with people. But the problem, I think, is that actually in the Parliamentary Labour Party, she's a minority in that respect. I mean, if you look at most MPs now, and don't get me wrong, they all work hard. Don't misunderstand me, but they come from that background often, all too often in the Parliamentary Labour Party, where they come through university, they work either for a charity or a think tank, there's some sort of policy wonk or research assistant, and then they find a safe seat in Parliament. And really, have never had what we said earlier, never had a proper job. Very few of them have had any direct contact with the private sector. And even fairly recently, you could look at the Labour benches in the Commons. And you go back to the 70s and 80s, a huge number of MPs who had those sort of proper jobs.
Exactly.
People who had worked down mines and in steel works, come up
exactly. The Skinners, everybody like that.
The Skinners, and there were lots of people like that. They're a tiny percentage of the party.
There was there's something funny I've just remembered when you saying that. There was an absolutely brilliant article in the Daily Telegraph, I don't know, sort of shortly into the Blair, so 99 something. Shortly into the Blair period. And it was a Conservative columnist saying, I despair. I look around at the Labour MPs now. Obviously, our lot are all toffs and arseholes. They've always come from the same stock. But Labour, time was, you'd see that guy used to be a miner, and he's been lofted here by his union, and he's there to represent the interests of the working class. There'll be a miner, a coal worker, all these people come from manufacturing. And he said, look at it now, look at them now. They're lawyers, they're journalists, they're teachers. Every single one of them just has no clue about what their story is.
There were people like that.
Hang on. Sorry. And the writer of that article, Mr. Boris Johnson.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah. There were people like that, and I only know this because I watched a TV drama about it recently on Asquith's cabinet on the approach to the First World War. There were sort of representatives of the mines and so on. There were people who had at least. I mean, they weren't miners. They were but they had some close contact with the industrial realities.
Well, when apparently Keir Hardie, when he went to Parliament for his first day, he got to the security gate, and the police officer saw him in his cloth cap and said, "Have you come to work on the roof?" He said, "No, I've come to work on the floor."
Do you think we're this is, I just want to, like a massive sort of change of direction, but this, and I might just be reflecting myself, do you think as a country we are overly preoccupied with the politics of America just because it's more glamorous, more interesting, and higher stakes for the world?
Wow,
and
that was years ago.
Yeah, did it? I don't know. I feel we are. I feel, but it might be Twitter, which isn't the real world, I grant.
It's really not.
No, I don't sense that particularly.
Okay.
I think there is Ian just said about Twitter. I think that one thing David Cameron got right when he said that, we need to understand Twitter and Britain are not the same thing. And he was bang on that, because I think there's a problem for the left. I see it, that they look at Twitter and they see the narrative on Twitter and they think that's the narrative of the country, and therefore, they have to feed into that. They have to reflect that. But actually, there is, I know it sounds a bit cliche, but there is a silent majority out there. There are many millions of people living in provincial Britain, post-industrial Britain, small-town Britain, who have got no idea about Twitter and what's being said on Twitter, and probably are not paying attention particularly.
But it burst onto the streets last summer. I think the Black Lives Matter riots in this country, and this is maybe a controversial point of view, but I don't think they were justified by police killings in this country. And I know there is a history of, well, the Macpherson report asserted it, institutional racism, and I'm in no position to, dispute those findings. But we had 2 police killings of unarmed men on the streets of London in the previous year, and one of those was that guy on London Bridge who'd been attacked with a narwhal spike 10 minutes earlier.
Aren't you saying that we look across to America and envy it? Isn't the same thing?
We import their trouble. That's what I worry about. We think their problems are somehow more glamorous. Socially, their socio-political and economic problems seem somehow to be more of the zeitgeist of the world, of the developed world.
I thought it was an act of solidarity. I thought it was that. You're saying it's an act of narcissism?
Well, I wouldn't be qualified in the Freudian sense, but yeah, to a degree, or like, yeah.
I think it was an act of solidarity that very quickly became a moral lecture that people were uncomfortable with. And when it started going into the moral lecture in terms of every time before a football match it happened, and it was on the sitcoms, you'd watch it, and there's Dawn French in The Vicar of Dibley taking the knee and seeing politicians doing it all the time. I think that people get to a point, and this is where I think, campaigns like that get it badly wrong sometimes. I think that campaign in the end sent the message to lots of ordinary anti-racist Britons: look, you're in a cesspit of a racist country and you're probably racist yourself, and if you're not supporting us, then shame on you. Whereas I think the vast majority of people think, actually, I am anti-racist. I believe we should challenge racism. I can understand why you might sort of want to take the knee as an act of solidarity, but don't keep hectoring me about it. Don't keep lecturing me about it, because the danger then is what you do is you turn people away from it. So what could be a uniting cause, and a worthy cause, you end up creating divisions among people because you look like you're just lecturing them and you're not taking them with you. And sadly, I think that's where the Black Lives Matter movement.
I'd agree with that. Ian, go. Yeah.
I remember writing years ago about how we should stop expecting old people to abide by the moral precepts that are being reinvented every week on Twitter. So I don't see any purchase for saying, look, Mary Berry's transphobic because she did. Come on, mate. 1980. I mean, give her what? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I totally know what you mean.
It's like the use of the word, instead of saying black person, a lot of the older generation still say coloured person.
Yeah.
Now the truth is, they often use it as a term of politeness, because when they were growing up, they were taught, actually, it's more polite to describe a black person as a coloured person. Yeah. So I occasionally hear, elderly relatives and whatever say coloured person. Now, the idea that they should be hounded because they are simply abiding by the kind of social mores of their own time. We've got into a habit of applying standards to today's world from yesterday or the other way around.
I think one of the things about young people is they find it very hard to believe that as you get older, certain things calcify and sort of just lodge in your brain. I remember somebody talking about Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
Unable to accept that it was no longer a political reality, but
I mean, yes, to all that. The B I was going to mention was that the knee, taking the knee for me, just for me as an old person, seemed, I don't want to say risible. I mean, I don't want to say comic, because obviously it's a very solemn thing you're doing. But there was a picture of Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer taking the knee in what looked like their office for a photographer who was taking the pic. And just honestly, I know it's not supposed to be funny, but it was.
Well, nobody really knew what it was supposed to be, do they? I mean, to me, taking the knee is something I would do if I was about to be knighted. So
that's unlikely to be fair.
I know, yes, at the present stage, but I could make a late surge. But it does suggest that you're acknowledging like an intangible superiority, like a sort of like an ineffable, a being of a higher.
There's a difference, I think, between what we've seen in terms of taking the knee, the constant, as I said, what became a moral lecture, and when was it, in the 70s, when the three athletes, including a white competitor who got the bronze medal, I think, did the Black Power salute on the rostrum, and that was kind of one-off, very hard-hitting, very powerful, very symbolic. And I think that's how you win people to it. That's gone down in the annals of history and it still resonates with people today. If for the next year or two, every athlete got up on the rostrum and did the same thing, it would have diluted that original act. And I think that was the danger of the Black Lives Matter. That's what happened with the Black Lives Matter.
Certainly seemed that when they put Black Lives Matter on the back of every shirt of every player in the Premiership, it completely negates any kind of stance, any moral individual. But I have this theory, and I don't know whether you share this, that woke capital, which is a kind of, again, a sort of Twitter phrase. But my theory is that these are the issues that capital is very happy to endorse and to encourage people to become inflamed about, because it distracts them from the actual sort of, the infrastructural inequalities and iniquities that are going on.
I tell you, who does make me proud to be English rather than British, and that's Marcus Rashford. I just tucked up. See what I've done there? I've virtue signaled, but without taking the knee or doing anything.
Your arthritis stops you getting down there, Ian, to be fair.
I'm offering. I am literally.
You're not taking the knee, you're getting another bottle out of your cellar.
He won't be able to get up now.
Done a hamstring.
Arthritic knee.
I've done a hamstring, mate.
But the other thing about the woke capitalism thing is that it's entirely cynical, because it's for them, they're not interested, I don't think, these big multinationals, in the social causes. It's about being with the zeitgeist at a particular moment in time and tapping into it for commercial reasons, because the minute doing the right thing threatens their profits. And I wrote about this recently, and I used the example of the Turkish footballer was playing for Arsenal, Ozil was playing for Arsenal, and tweeted something about the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in China. And of course, Arsenal's got huge commercial interests in China, and immediately the club disassociated itself from Ozil's comments and said, it's a personal view, it doesn't reflect the opinions of Arsenal Football Club. So when push comes to shove, actually, it's all about profit. And it's
China and sport. I mean, that's hilarious. There's countless examples of that in American sport as well. Where they will stand up against Donald Trump, but they won't say a word against the CCP.
Yeah. I don't know, people. Honestly, they drive you balmy, don't they? The world, fucking no. Honestly, I don't know what it's come to, frankly.
He's had enough. I can tell. Ian's hit his limit.
You sound like you don't want to, Harry Enfield. You don't want to do that, Mr. Cynical.
Do you think we need to be worried, though? Do you think we need to be worried about China? That is something always like glowering on the horizon. Every time you glance over there, it's just bubbling. Is it
for a minute?
Go on.
China, great. What? China? Who cares? Can we go now?
How would you boycott it if you wanted to?
Boycott China.
Do they make good?
I can see it. I can see your phone.
I think, to answer your question, I think we should. I think China is. It's a.
I mean, in neither the Labour Party nor the Tories seem to have any policy at all about a country that is essentially in very similar mode at the moment to where Nazi Germany was in about 1935. To all intents and purposes, I can't see any. I know that obviously America exaggerates their military threat. And if anything, America's military threat remains vastly more significant. But in terms of their internal politics, I mean, you know, we've always thought, oh, what would I have done in 1935? Well, now you know. Do you know what I mean?
It's this sort of sinister combination, I think, of what I described once as the Stasi and the square mile. So you've got the kind of ruthless authoritarianism and the sort of CCP. And all of the human rights abuses and stuff, but now it's sort of bought into neoliberalism and the free market. So gives, you know, to all intents and purposes, gives the impression, you know, you've got these huge towers and the financial centers and places like Shanghai and whatever, of being just like any other Western country, but actually this really sinister authoritarian regime running it.
Yeah.
And how can you not be on your guard against a country that powerful, which is run by such a regime? Yeah, we should worry about it, I think.
Yeah, I've just landed a gig. You know, I've just landed a gig, right? Classic satire for the Chinese Communist Party. So
is it Death of Mao? Is it Death of Mao? Because I want to see that.
So I
want to see Michael Palin as Deng Xiaoping.
While we were still recording, Simon, you'll be pretending to tuck into some succulent panda.
You would normally be on a tiramisu by now, but you can have a bit of ground panda on it if you want.
Oh, sorry, we'll have to edit. Well, I could, having recorded your fucking thing, I could maybe drop that edit into the star.
How's your lobster gone down?
Oh, very nicely. Look, I'm well on the way. Come on,
no wonder.
Come on, I've got work to do. What are we doing?
So tell me, Ian, you've got 3 minutes to assume that you can reach the Labour Party. What would you say to them? Sign off with this.
I would say just ease back on the culture wars stuff. Reconnect regionally. Your strength is at grassroots level. You need to be talking much more about how the Labour Party integrate at city level with the NHS, with the unions, work out how you can improve the lives of ordinary people before, as what always happens. Remember, the BNP used to come in and say, oh, if you've got a broken window, you tell us about it because we'll go down to council and get it fixed for you. All that shit, the boring shit. They were in a much better position than any other political party in this country to do that. They've got an energised local whatever. Oh God, yes, and I don't know.
BNP, Bins and Parks.
Hey, yeah. Move to the right of the BNP. Get them. That's the last thing anyone's expecting. Get them that way.
Without addressing any of Ian's points, but totally sort of unilaterally, what would your message be? Obviously, this is not the first opportunity you've had, but go on.
I would say that in everything you say and do over the next few years, think about how it's going to be received in red wall, working class, blue collar seats, the type that have left you, the type that have abandoned you, and for good reason. Stop obsessing about fringe issues that don't necessarily stress working class people on a daily basis. You know, talking about Palestine and LGBT rights and gender fluidity and all of this sort of stuff. I don't say there's not a place for those things to be discussed, but don't obsess about them in a way that working class communities don't. Have a clear economic narrative about how you're going to improve the lives of these communities, bring full employment, you know, make their lives better in a economic sense, but combine that with understanding the importance of what I call the cultural politics of belonging and place and community, in a way that, yes, is inclusive and includes people, but you know, doesn't violate their sense of place and their sense of belonging. And too many Labour policies in recent years have done that, and they need to think about that.
That's marvellous.
One last thought.
Yeah, go on.
One last thought. I would like to see the Labour Party mend defences with the unions, because I think they've drifted apart, and I think they need to come back together again. And here's an interesting thing. I'm a member of 2 unions. One, the Writers' Guild of Great Britain, which is lovely. And obviously you don't have to join it if you don't want to. So it's all very, it's all very polite and well-meaning and all the rest of it. But the one I'm a member of in America, the Writers' Guild of America, operates out of Los Angeles and is a closed shop system. Now, I haven't been in a closed shop system since I was in the NUJ in the 1970s. And there it is, in the heart of the capitalist empire of America. They're running a closed shop. You cannot work on a show. You cannot write for a show unless you're a member of the WGA.
Well, there was a very high-profile strike not long ago, wasn't there?
Yeah, it thrills me. I love that. I come and everybody out. I fucking love all that.
Yeah.
It's coming from there. You know, not bloody, not Darlington.
I like it. I like it. Well, I think you've defined maybe two goalposts. If they can slot a ball between those two, they should probably win back the red wall. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I'll give it. I'd make them 8-5 on, Stuart.
I'm particularly pleased, by the way, Paul, that during that your last impassioned plea, you moved your head slightly to your right, I think it would be, and I was able to contextualize what was previously just a sort of isolated white patch on the wall and see that it was one of a number of artistic artifacts that you've got your children, have you, or is that?
Yeah, that my daughter for Easter, when was it, last week or the week before? She did a few sketches to put on the wall because we had some guests over for Easter, and I've been too lazy to take them down. So that's.
I literally thought it was some kind of weird glitch on the screen.
That'll be worth something one day.
It's an Easter egg. Gents, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
I'm moving backwards, Simon. I'm not moving left to right. I'm moving backwards in time.
Are you now fading back into your psychedelic picture on the back wall there? It's very nice.
Mind you don't fall down into that wine cellar.
Absolute pleasure, gents.